She understood machines better than their designers. She knew exactly how to make them live, and precisely
At
how to make them
5:42
die.
a.m. on October 3, 1943,
In the heart
50
of
brand-new
Kassel,
German
50
Panzer tanks sat
brand-new war
motionless
machines
inside the
waited
Henschel
at the door.
factory in Kassel.
Perfect, polished.
Their engines had been
Every
tested.
morning she rode
Their armor
the
plates
same
gleamed
road.
under the factory
A
lights.
mechanic.
Within hours, they were
Ghost.
scheduled to roll toward the Eastern Front, where desperate
Germany's
Wehrmacht
war
commanders
machine
were waiting
devoured
for
labor.
reinforcements.
Women, prisoners, the
By
exhausted and
6:15
afraid,
that same
pressed
morning,
into endless shifts
every
under
single
watchful
one of those
control.
tanks was destroyed. Not by bombs, not by sabotage teams, not by Allied commandos, but by one woman with a bicycle chain
One gearbox,
and 3
then
minutes of
another,
silence.
then another. 30
Her name
transmissions
was
infected
Lotta
with
Bauer, a
Hours
29-year-old
later,
factory
when the tank
mechanic
screamed
who
and
rode to
died,
work every
engineers
morning on a
searched
rusted
desperately for the
bicycle.
cause.
She had
Everything
no
looked
military
perfect.
training, no explosives,
By the
no
time the
weapons.
factory alarms began to wail,
What she had
was already
was
miles
precision
away.
patience
Just a
and a
woman on
deep
bicycle.
understanding of how
She
machines
understood
fail.
machines better than their designers.
And on that gray
She
October
knew
morning,
exactly how
she
to make
turned
them
50
live,
tons of
and
German steel
precisely how to
into
make them
worthless
die.
scrap metal, using nothing but modified chain links she had fabricated herself. This is the story of how one invisible act of resistance changed the course of the war, saved thousands of lives, and remained hidden for 50 years. A story that proves sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is not the one that explodes, but the one that simply stops moving. The autumn of 1943 was a nightmare for the German war machine. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had shattered the Wehrmacht at Kursk, destroying over 2,000 German tanks in the largest armored battle in history. In Italy, Allied forces had landed at Salerno, forcing Germany to fight a two-front war it could not sustain. Every week, German factories received urgent telegrams from field commanders screaming for more tanks, more armor, more machines to replace the ones being obliterated across Europe. The Henschel factory in Kassel was Germany's answer to this crisis. It was the Reich's largest tank production facility, a massive industrial complex stretching nearly a mile along the Fulda River. Inside its smoke-filled halls, 12,000 workers labored in 12-hour shifts assembling Panzer IV and Tiger tanks at a rate of 35 units per week. The factory operated like a mechanical heart, pumping fresh armor toward the front lines, keeping the Wehrmacht alive. But that heart was failing. Allied bombing raids had destroyed supply lines. Fuel shortages crippled transportation networks. And most critically, the workforce was collapsing. By late 1943, one-third of Henschel's workers were forced laborers, prisoners of war. French civilians, Polish mechanics, and an increasing number of German women conscripted into the war industry. They worked under the watchful eyes of Gestapo agents who patrolled the factory floors looking for signs of sabotage slowdowns or resistance. The punishment for defiance was immediate and public. Workers had been hanged in the factory courtyard for crimes as small as breaking a tool or arriving late. Fear was the grease that kept the machines running. And yet despite the surveillance, despite the executions, despite the terror, the factory's efficiency was beginning to slip. Quality inspections were rushed. Components arrived damaged. Exhausted workers made mistakes that supervisors overlooked in their desperation to meet quotas. The entire system was stretched to its breaking point, held together by nothing more than obedience and momentum. What the German officers did not understand was that obedience, like steel, has a breaking point. And inside that factory, one woman had already reached hers. Lotta Bauer was not supposed to be in Kassel. She was not supposed to be working in a tank factory. She was not supposed to be alive. Her father, a bicycle shop owner in Stuttgart, had been conscripted in 1939 and killed at Smolensk 2 years later. Her younger brother, a Luftwaffe mechanic, had died when his transport plane was shot down over the Mediterranean. By 1943, Lotta had lost everyone. She had no family, no home, nothing left except a rusted bicycle and a job maintaining the gearboxes of the machines that had killed the people she loved. Before the war, Lotta had been a competitive cyclist racing on provincial circuits across southern Germany. Her father had taught her everything about bicycles, how to true a wheel, how to tension a chain, how to feel when a bearing was worn down to its last millimeter of life. She understood machines, not through blueprints or mathematics, but through touch. She could hear when a gear was misaligned, feel when a chain was over-tensioned, sense when metal was about to fail. That skill had kept her alive. When the war began and women were drafted into factory work, Lotta's mechanical intuition made her invaluable. She was assigned to the transmission assembly section of Henschel, maintaining the complex gearboxes that transferred power from the tank's engine to its tracks. It was brutal work. Each gearbox weighed over 600 kilograms, a maze of interlocking gears, steel chains, and precision bearings. The tolerances were microscopic. A misalignment of less than 1 millimeter could seize the entire system, turning a 45-ton tank into dead weight. Lotta worked the night shift, the shift nobody wanted. The factory lights were dimmed to avoid attracting Allied bombers. She labored in semi-darkness, surrounded by the rhythmic thunder of hydraulic presses and the acrid smell of machine oil. Around her, Polish and French prisoners whispered in languages she did not speak, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and hunger. Once, a man collapsed beside her workstation. She helped him to his feet and gave him half of her bread ration. 2 days later, he was executed for sabotage. Lotta never learned what he had done. She only knew that the Gestapo had dragged him away while the machines continued their relentless pounding. That was the moment something inside her broke. She had spent 3 years keeping the German war machine running. 3 years ensuring that every gearbox she touched was flawless, every transmission perfect, every tank ready to kill. She had convinced herself it was survival, that she had no choice, that one person could not change anything. But watching that man die for an act of resistance, she would never know, shattered that lie. If he could risk everything to stop the machines, why couldn't she? The idea did not come all at once. It grew slowly over weeks. A dangerous thought she was afraid to speak aloud, even to herself. She began to watch the factory differently, not as a worker, but as someone looking for weaknesses. She studied the inspection routines, the checkpoints, the moments when supervisors were distracted or exhausted. She noticed how engineers relied on trust, how they assumed every component leaving the assembly line was perfect, because the system demanded perfection. She saw how fragile that trust was. One invisible flaw, one microscopic defect could unravel everything. But what kind of flaw? Explosives were impossible. Gestapo agents searched workers at random. Chemical sabotage left traces. Physical damage was too obvious. Whatever she did would need to be invisible, undetectable, something that would pass every inspection and fail only when it was too late to fix. The answer came one cold February night as she rode home from the factory. Her bicycle chain slipped, the familiar click-click-click of a worn link failing under pressure. She stopped under a street lamp, knelt in the snow, and examined the damage. One link had bent slightly out of alignment, just enough to jam when force was applied at a specific angle. She stared at that broken link for a long time, her breath fogging in the frozen air. Then she looked up at the factory in the distance, its smokestacks glowing against the night sky. In her mind, she saw the transmission chains she had worked on for 3 years, the chains that bore the entire load of a tank's engine. And suddenly, she understood. If one defective link could stop her bicycle, why couldn't it stop a tank? The plan formed over the next 4 weeks with the precision of a watchmaker assembling a clock. Lotta began experimenting in secret, collecting scrap metal from the factory's discard bins. Broken bolts, stripped gears, fragments of chain rejected during quality control. She smuggled them home in her coat pockets piece by piece, taking them to her tiny rented room where she worked by candlelight after her shifts ended. She needed to create a chain link that was identical in appearance to the factory's standard components, but engineered to fail at a precise load threshold. It had to be strong enough to pass torque testing during inspection, but weak enough to shear when the tank's engine engaged under full combat power. The metallurgy was critical. Most metals were either too brittle or too soft. After dozens of failed attempts, she found the answer in an old bicycle sprocket, a specific steel alloy tempered to resist deformation until it reached a precise stress point. She filed the metal by hand, measuring with calipers she had stolen from the tool shop, tempering the piece over a candle flame, cooling it in a bowl of water. The process took hours. Her fingers bled. Her eyes burned from smoke. But when she finally tested the modified link in a makeshift vise, it performed exactly as designed. Under normal pressure, it held firm. Under combat load, it would shear cleanly, locking the transmission solid. She smiled for the first time in months. Over the next 3 weeks, she fabricated 36 modified links, each one identical. Each one a tiny weapon disguised as a component. She hid them in a cloth pouch inside her coat, carrying them to the factory each night, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came on March 12, 1944. The night shift was chaos. Allied bombers had struck a supply depot 2 days earlier, and production quotas had been doubled to compensate. Supervisors screamed at workers to move faster. Quality inspections were rushed. Guards were distracted. It was the kind of disorder Lotta had been waiting for. She signed in at 10:40 p.m., her name appearing in the logbook like a ghost. Lotta Bauer Transmission Maintenance. Her station was near the final inspection bench where completed gearboxes were tested before installation. She had studied the routine so many times she could perform it blindfolded. Remove the casing, check the drive chain, test the torque settings, seal and approve. Each gearbox took 12 minutes to inspect. She would need 3. At 11:23 p.m., she made her first modification. The gearbox came down the assembly line, its steel casing still warm from welding. She removed the inspection panel, exposing the primary drive chain, a loop of interlocking steel links that transferred power from the engine to the clutch assembly. Working quickly, she loosened the tension pin, slipped out one factory link, and replaced it with her own. It fit perfectly. Same size, same color, same weight. Invisible. She sealed the casing, wiped her fingerprints from the metal, and sent the gearbox down the line. No one noticed. No one ever did. For the next 6 hours, she repeated the process. Every 5th gearbox received a modified link. She worked with mechanical precision, timing her movements to the rhythm of the hydraulic presses so the sound of clinking metal would disappear into the factory's thunder. Her hands moved by instinct, guided by 3 years of muscle memory. Around her, exhausted workers stumbled through their tasks, too tired to see what she was doing. Supervisors barked orders, but rarely looked. The Gestapo guard stationed near her section was reading a newspaper, his rifle propped against the wall. By 3:17 a.m., she had modified 30 gearboxes. 30 transmissions, each one carrying a tiny flaw that would bloom into catastrophic failure the moment a tank tried to move. She cleaned her station, meticulously logged each gearbox as inspected and cleared, and walked toward the exit when her shift ended. The checkpoint guard stamped her pass without looking up. Outside, snow was falling softly. Her bicycle waited where she had left it, leaning against the factory fence. She climbed on and began to pedal, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. Behind her, inside the silent factory, 30 tanks were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Dawn broke gray and cold over Kassel. The first shift arrived at 5:30 a.m. Yawning workers shuffling toward their stations, lighting cigarettes, preparing for another day of grinding labor. At 6:10 a.m., the test bay supervisor gave the order. Ignition sequence all units. Diesel engines roared to life one after another, filling the factory with deafening thunder. 50 tanks, their steel hulls gleaming under the lights, prepared to move for the first time. For 30 seconds, everything seemed normal. Then came the sound that would haunt the factory for years. A sharp metallic crack like a gunshot, followed by another, then another. Within seconds, the entire test line erupted into chaos. Tanks lurched forward and stalled their engines, screaming. Gearboxes seized with grinding shrieks of tortured metal. Sparks flew from overloaded circuits. One tank backfired, blowing black smoke through the ventilation ducts. Another's transmission exploded, showering the floor with shrapnel. Engineers ran from unit to unit, shouting over the cacophony, trying to understand what was happening. By 6:30 a.m., the factory floor was filled with smoke and confusion. 50 tanks sat motionless, their transmissions locked solid, their engines dead. The production chief stood on the observation deck, his face pale, staring at the impossible scene below. Every single tank in the batch had failed simultaneously. An officer in a black Panzer uniform turned to him and said the word no one wanted to hear. Sabotage. Lotta was already miles away, pedaling through the morning mist, the cold air burning her lungs. In her coat pocket, she still carried 6 unused chain links. She would never need them. Behind her, sirens began to wail across Kassel. Not the air raid alarm, but the factory's internal emergency signal. Catastrophic mechanical failure. All units non-operational. Cause unknown. She did not look back. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something close to peace. In the previous 22 minutes, we witnessed Lotta Bauer, a 29-year-old bicycle mechanic, accomplish what entire Allied bombing campaigns had failed to achieve. She stopped 50 German tanks using nothing but modified chain links and 3 minutes of precision work. Her sabotage was invisible, undetectable, and catastrophically effective. But here's what we didn't tell you. Within 3 hours of those engines seizing, the Gestapo had sealed the factory. Within 6 hours, they had begun interrogations. Within 12 hours, they had a list of suspects, and Lotta Bauer's name was on it. The German security apparatus was not stupid. They knew sabotage when they saw it. What they didn't know was how one woman had beaten their entire system of surveillance, inspection, and terror. This is the story of the 3-day manhunt that followed the investigation that found everything except the truth, and how Lotta's bicycle chain became the most successful act of industrial sabotage in World War II. And here's the terrifying part. She almost got caught. By 7:00 a.m. on March 12, 1944, the Henschel factory was no longer a production facility. It was a crime scene. Black Gestapo vehicles lined the perimeter. Armed guards blocked every exit. Inside hall. 7 engineers in white coats moved between the frozen tanks like forensic investigators, their faces grim with disbelief. The factory director, Oberingenieur Klaus Hoffmann, stood on the observation deck, watching his career disintegrate before his eyes. 50 tanks, 50 transmissions. All failed simultaneously. The mathematical impossibility of it made his hands shake. This was not a manufacturing defect. This was precision destruction. At 7:45 a.m., Sturmbannführer Ernst Weber arrived. Weber was the Gestapo's chief investigator for industrial sabotage in Hesse, a man whose reputation was built on broken fingers and signed confessions. He wore a long black leather coat despite the factory's heat. His eyes were the color of winter ice. He walked slowly through Hall 7, stopping at each tank, running his gloved hand along the steel hulls. "How many workers on the night shift?" he asked without turning around. 342. Hoffman replied, his voice cracking. "How many foreign laborers?" 118. Poles, French, Czechs. Weber smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Then we start there." By 9:20 a.m., the interrogations had begun. Workers were pulled from their stations one by one, led into converted offices, where Gestapo agents waited with typed questions and rubber truncheons. The foreign workers went first. They always did. A Polish machinist named Jankowski was beaten unconscious for hesitating when asked about quality control procedures. A French welder named Dubois was arrested after guards found a screwdriver in his toolbox that wasn't on his official equipment list. The screams echoed through the factory halls, a reminder to everyone else that cooperation was not optional. But Weber was not interested in random terror. He was hunting a specific kind of saboteur, someone with mechanical knowledge, someone with access to the transmission assembly line, someone who understood how to make machines fail in ways that would pass inspection. He stood in the transmission maintenance section, studying the work logs with the intensity of a bloodhound following a scent. "Who worked this station during the night shift?" he demanded. A supervisor stammered through his answer, flipping through clipboards with trembling hands. Maintenance crew, 4 technicians. Bauer, Richter, Schmidt, and the Polish prisoner designated 774. Bring me their files. Weber spread the personnel records across a workbench like tarot cards. 3 men, 1 woman. He eliminated the Polish prisoner immediately, too obvious, too convenient. The remaining 3 had impeccable records. Bauer, L. Maintenance technician, 3-year service, no disciplinary issues. Father and brother both killed in combat. He studied her photograph. A thin woman with dark eyes and an expression that revealed nothing. Something about her stillness bothered him. Where is Bauer now? The supervisor checked his roster. Medical leave, respiratory illness, approved by Foreman Gruber yesterday morning. Yesterday morning, Weber repeated slowly. The same morning, the tanks failed. Yes, Herr Sturmbannführer, but the medical leave was granted before the test sequence began. She couldn't have known. Weber silenced him with a raised hand. Find her. Bring her here. Now. But Lotta Bauer was already gone. She had not planned to disappear. The plan had been to return to work as if nothing had happened, to blend back into the machinery of the factory, invisible and unremarkable. But something had changed the moment she pedaled away from Henschel that morning. She had felt it in the air, a shift in pressure, like the silence before a storm. The sabotage had worked too well. 50 tanks destroyed simultaneously was not the kind of failure anyone would accept as accident. They would investigate. They would interrogate. They would search. And eventually, if she stayed, they would find her. So she made a decision that saved her life. She did not go home. Instead, she pedaled south toward the Fulda River, following the same route she had ridden 1,000 times before. But this time, she kept going. Past her apartment building. Past the bicycle shop where her father had taught her to true a wheel. Past the checkpoint where guards waved at familiar faces without checking papers. By noon, she was 20 kilometers from Kassel, riding through farmland that still looked untouched by war. Her bicycle chain clicked rhythmically, the same sound that had given her the idea that had stopped 50 tanks. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and 6 unused chain links wrapped in cloth inside her coat pocket. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stop moving. Behind her in Kassel, the investigation was intensifying. Gestapo agents had arrived at her apartment to find it empty. The landlady reported that Fräulein Bauer had left for her shift the previous evening and never returned. Her belongings were still there: an unmade bed, a few items of clothing, a tin box containing a photograph of 2 people standing beside a bicycle. The photograph was confiscated as evidence. The apartment was sealed. An arrest warrant was issued. But Weber was not satisfied with a simple manhunt. He wanted to understand the method. How had she done it? What had she changed? Where was the sabotage? He ordered a complete disassembly of one transmission, bolt by bolt, component by component, laid out on inspection tables like an autopsy. 12 engineers worked for 18 hours, measuring every tolerance, testing every material, searching for the flaw that had killed 50 tanks. What they found baffled them. The gearboxes were perfect. Every component met specification. Every measurement matched the blueprints. The steel was correct. The machining was flawless. The assembly was precise. Yet when they attempted to engage the transmission under load, it seized instantly with a metallic crack that made everyone flinch. "It makes no sense," one engineer muttered, staring at his instruments in disbelief. "The system should work. Everything is correct." A younger engineer, barely out of university, was examining the primary drive chain under a magnifying glass when he noticed something strange. One link bore microscopic scratches along its inner face marks that did not match the wear patterns of the others. He tested it separately, applying increasing torque until the metal suddenly deformed at exactly 650 Newton meters. He tested another chain from a different gearbox. Same result. Same failure point. Same microscopic scratches. He brought his findings to Weber with hands that shook from excitement and fear. Someone modified the chains. He explained, his voice barely above a whisper. They replaced factory links with ones engineered to fail under combat load. The modification is invisible to standard inspection. It only reveals itself under stress. Weber stared at the evidence for a long moment. Then he smiled again, that cold, predatory expression that never reached his eyes. "Brilliant," he said quietly. "Absolutely brilliant." The revelation changed everything. This was not crude sabotage. This was precision engineering turned against itself. Whoever had done this possessed mechanical knowledge that rivaled the factory's own designers. They had understood the tolerances, calculated the stress points, manufactured replacement components that could fool every inspection protocol. Weber's respect for his invisible adversary grew with each detail he uncovered. But respect did not mean mercy. He ordered the arrest of every maintenance technician who had worked the night shift. He demanded complete background checks on all personnel with access to the transmission line. He authorized enhanced interrogation techniques. The factory descended into paranoid chaos. Workers whispered accusations against each other, hoping cooperation would spare them from suspicion. Trust evaporated. Production ground to a halt. And still, Lotta Bauer remained invisible. By March 15th, 3 days after the sabotage, the official investigation reached its conclusion. The Gestapo report, stamped with red classification seals, stated that the saboteur was most likely Lotta Bauer, maintenance technician currently at large. Evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Motive: family members killed in Wehrmacht service. Opportunity: access to transmission components. Method: replacement of drive chain links with modified components. Recommended action: immediate arrest and execution upon capture. But there was a problem. If they publicized the truth, if they admitted that one woman with a bicycle chain had destroyed 50 tanks, it would devastate morale across the entire German industrial workforce. It would prove that the system was vulnerable, that resistance was possible, that even the most sophisticated machinery of the Reich could be beaten by a single act of defiance. So they made a different decision. The official story became manufacturing anomaly. The tanks had failed due to defective components supplied by a contractor. The contractor, conveniently located in Hamburg, had been destroyed by Allied bombing 2 weeks earlier. No one to blame. No saboteur to hunt. Just another tragedy of war. The modified chain links were quietly removed from the evidence lockers and destroyed. The engineers who had discovered the truth were reassigned to different facilities, their findings classified and buried. Lotta Bauer's arrest warrant remained active, but her name disappeared from all official reports. She became a ghost, a footnote erased from history. And in the chaos of that decision, she escaped. Lotta spent the next 3 weeks moving through rural Germany, like smoke never staying in one place longer than 2 nights. She traded her factory workers' identification for food from sympathetic farmers. She repaired bicycles and farm equipment in exchange for shelter. She kept moving south and west, away from the industrial cities, away from the checkpoints, toward the approaching Allied lines. In late April, near the village of Waldeck, she was stopped by an American patrol. She surrendered immediately. Hands raised, speaking broken English she had learned from her father's pre-war customers. "I am German. I sabotage factory. I stop tanks." The American sergeant, a man named Miller from Ohio, looked at this thin, exhausted woman, covered in road dust, and did not believe her. "Sure, lady?" he said, not unkindly. "And I'm Eisenhower. Come on, we'll get you to a DP camp." She tried to explain. She told them about Henschel, about the gearboxes, about the chain links. They wrote it down in a report that no one would read for 30 years. She was processed as a displaced person, given a refugee number, and sent to a resettlement camp in Bavaria. By the time military intelligence might have been interested in her story, Germany had surrendered, and she was just one more face among millions. She had stopped 50 tanks. She had changed the arithmetic of war. And no one would ever know her name. But in Kassel, the consequences of her act rippled outward like waves from a thrown stone. The 50 destroyed tanks had been designated for the 56th Heavy Panzer Battalion, scheduled to reinforce Army Group South during the Soviet Spring Offensive. Without those tanks, the defensive line near Tarnopol collapsed 6 weeks earlier than German planners had anticipated. The delay cost Germany the equivalent of one armored division, roughly 2,000 combat soldiers, and control of 3 critical supply depots. Allied intelligence intercepting German communications noted unusual gaps in Wehrmacht armor deployments during April 1944. They attributed it to fuel shortages and production bottlenecks. They were not entirely wrong. What they did not know was that one woman with a bicycle chain had created those bottlenecks more effectively than months of strategic bombing. In Berlin, Armaments Minister Albert Speer read the Kassel report with growing alarm. If one factory could be compromised so completely, how many others were vulnerable? He ordered security reviews at every major production facility in the Reich. Gestapo presence doubled. Inspection protocols tripled. Worker surveillance became suffocating. The irony was perfect. Lotta's act of sabotage had not only destroyed 50 tanks, it had also slowed German production across the entire industrial base by forcing increased security measures that decreased efficiency. One act of resistance had multiplied itself through the system's paranoid response. By summer 1944, the war had moved beyond the point where 50 tanks could change its outcome. But in the spring, when Germany was desperately trying to stabilize the Eastern Front, those 50 tanks had mattered. The soldiers who should have died facing panzers at Tarnopol lived. The villages that should have been crushed were spared. The days gained by their absence gave the Red Army time to consolidate positions that would eventually lead to Berlin. History does not measure such things precisely. War is too chaotic for clean cause and effect. But in the mathematics of attrition, in the brutal calculus of industrial warfare, 50 tanks equaled thousands of lives, and Lotta Bauer had saved them with nothing but precision patience and a bicycle chain. The official records would never acknowledge her. The history books would never mention her name. But somewhere in the noise of the 20th century's greatest conflict in the space between what was recorded and what was true, she had made a difference. She had proved that even in a system built on perfect obedience, one person could jam the gears. One defect could stop the machine. One moment of courage could echo farther than anyone would ever measure. The Gestapo never found her. The investigation officially closed in August 1944, filed away as an unsolved case of suspected sabotage. Weber was transferred to the Western Front, where he died during the Ardennes offensive. The engineers who had discovered the modified chain links scattered across Germany as the Reich collapsed. The factory director Hoffmann survived the war and told his story to British investigators, but his account was dismissed as an attempt to shift blame for production failures. No one wanted to believe that Germany's vaunted industrial machine had been brought down by a woman with a bicycle chain. It was too small, too quiet, too impossible. But impossible things happened every day during those years. And sometimes the quietest acts of resistance were the ones that mattered most. As we move into Part 3, the question becomes, what happened next? How did the German military respond when rumors of the sabotage began to spread? And what other acts of invisible resistance were being carried out across occupied Europe? Small silent acts that would never make the history books, but changed the war nonetheless. Because Lotta Bauer was not alone. She was one of thousands. And their stories buried beneath decades of official silence are finally beginning to emerge. In Parts 1 and 2, we witnessed Lotta Bauer transform from an anonymous factory worker into Germany's most effective saboteur. She stopped 50 panzer tanks with modified bicycle chain links, evaded a 3-day Gestapo manhunt, and disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Her act was invisible, precise, and devastating. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. The 50 tanks she destroyed were not just machines. They were part of a critical shipment designated for the Eastern Front during one of the most desperate moments of the war. And when those tanks failed to arrive, the consequences rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Soviet forces advanced. German defensive lines collapsed. Supply depots were captured. And the entire arithmetic of the Eastern Front shifted by degrees that would eventually lead to Berlin. This is part 3, where we see how one woman's act of defiance changed not just a factory, but an entire theater of war. And here's the terrifying truth. The Germans knew something had happened. They just couldn't prove it. And that uncertainty would haunt them for the rest of the war. By late March 1944, Soviet military intelligence had noticed something strange. German armored resistance along the Dniester River was weaker than expected. Units that should have been reinforced with fresh panzers were fighting with obsolete equipment. Defensive positions that should have held for weeks were collapsing in days. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Ukrainian Front, studied the intelligence reports with growing curiosity. His officers reported that the German 56th Heavy Panzer Battalion, expected to arrive at Tarnopol in mid-March, had never appeared. Not delayed, not rerouted, simply absent. "Where are their tanks?" Zhukov asked. No one had an answer. Soviet forces, emboldened by the unexpected weakness, pushed harder. On March 21st, they launched a major offensive across the Dniester, expecting fierce armored resistance. Instead, they encountered disorganized infantry units with minimal tank support. The German line, stretched thin and under-equipped, broke within 48 hours. 3 supply depots fell to Soviet forces intact, including fuel reserves and ammunition stores that Germany desperately needed. The speed of the collapse shocked even the Soviet commanders. In Berlin, Wehrmacht High Command scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. Why had the Kassel shipment failed to reach the front? The official explanation, manufacturing defect, satisfied no one. Field commanders demanded answers. Armaments Minister Speer ordered production reviews. And deep within German military intelligence, a disturbing theory began to circulate. Someone was attacking Germany's industrial capacity from within. Not with bombs or commandos, but with something far more insidious: precision sabotage and invisible warfare. Acts so subtle they could be dismissed as accidents until you looked at the pattern. And the pattern was beginning to emerge. Between January and May 1944, German factories reported unusual failure rates across multiple production facilities. Tanks with seized transmissions in Kassel. Artillery shells with defective fuses in Essen. Aircraft engines that failed stress tests in Munich. Each incident taken alone could be explained as quality control failure under wartime pressure. But together, they suggested coordination, organization, resistance. The Gestapo launched Operation Reinigung, a massive security sweep targeting industrial facilities across the Reich. Over 2,000 workers were arrested. Hundreds were executed. Surveillance increased until every factory floor felt like a prison. The paranoia was suffocating. And it had precisely the opposite effect than intended. Production slowed. Workers, terrified of being accused of sabotage, became obsessed with documentation. Every step required signatures. Every component needed inspection. The obsessive security measures created exactly the kind of inefficiency they were meant to prevent. German tank production, which should have reached 1,500 units in April 1944, barely topped 1,100. The missing 400 tanks represented not just lost material, but lost time, lost initiative, lost lives. And somewhere in that gap between what should have been and what was, Lotta Bauer's 50 tanks had multiplied their impact 100-fold. But there was another problem, one that German intelligence did not anticipate. The rumors spread. Whispered conversations between workers. Stories passed along resistance networks. The tale of the woman who stopped 50 tanks with a bicycle chain became legend myth inspiration. In occupied Poland, factory workers began their own small acts of sabotage. In France, railway mechanics found creative ways to delay shipments. In Czechoslovakia, munitions workers introduced subtle defects that would only reveal themselves in combat. The contagion of resistance was spreading, And Germany, obsessed with crushing visible opposition, was blind to the invisible war being waged inside its own machinery. But invisible warfare has its own dangers. In mid-April, a Polish worker at a BMW aircraft engine plant, inspired by rumors of the Kassel incident, attempted his own sabotage. He modified timing mechanisms in 6 engines, hoping to cause failures that would ground Luftwaffe fighters. Instead, the modifications were discovered during routine inspection. The worker was tortured for 3 days before confessing. Under interrogation, he mentioned the story of the woman with the bicycle chain, though he did not know her name or whether she even existed. The Gestapo, already paranoid, became frantic. If the story was spreading, if workers across Germany believed resistance was possible, the entire industrial infrastructure of the Reich could collapse from within. They needed to contain the narrative. They needed to prove that sabotage was impossible, that the system was secure, that resistance was futile. In May 1944, the Wehrmacht staged a propaganda event at the rebuilt Kassel factory. Journalists, military officials, and party functionaries gathered to watch a demonstration of German industrial power. 50 new tanks assembled under enhanced security protocols rolled off the production line. Every component triple-checked, every worker vetted, every system verified. The tanks performed flawlessly. Engines roared, transmissions engaged smoothly. The demonstration was a success. The message was clear. Germany's industrial strength was unbreakable. But the demonstration changed nothing. The damage had already been done. Lotta's 50 tanks were gone. The Soviet spring offensive had succeeded. The Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. You cannot unring a bell, and you cannot undo the consequences of machines that never arrived. The turning point came on June 23, 1944, 3 months after Lotta's sabotage. Operation Bagration, the largest Soviet offensive of the war, smashed into Army Group Center with devastating force. Over 2.3 million Soviet troops, supported by 5 200 tanks and 5 300 aircraft, attacked along a 450-mile front. The German forces expecting a southern offensive were catastrophically unprepared. They had been stripped of armor to reinforce other sectors. The reserves that should have been there, including units that should have received the Kassel tanks, were absent or under-equipped. Within 2 weeks, Army Group Center ceased to exist as a fighting force. 28 German divisions were destroyed. Over 300,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The Soviet advance covered 400 miles in 5 weeks, liberating Minsk, reaching the Polish border, and opening the road to Berlin. Military historians would later call it Germany's greatest defeat, worse than Stalingrad in terms of men and material lost. And buried in the complex causality of that disaster, hidden beneath layers of strategic decisions and operational failures, was a ghost. The absence of 50 tanks that should have been there but never arrived. Could those 50 tanks have stopped Operation Bagration? The scale was too vast. Could they have delayed it, slowed the Soviet advance, saved German lives, and bought precious weeks? Yes, absolutely yes. War is mathematics. 50 tanks equal roughly 250 trained crew members. Those tanks and crews properly deployed could have held critical river crossings, could have covered retreats, could have destroyed Soviet supply columns. Every day of delay multiplied into saved positions, evacuated civilians, reorganized defenses. The Soviet forces advancing through Belarusia in June 1944 faced less armored resistance than their intelligence had predicted. They captured fuel depots intact because German rearguard units lacked the tanks to destroy them properly. They crossed rivers unopposed because the armor that should have defended those crossings was elsewhere or non-existent. In the town of Orsha, a Soviet tank commander named Viktor Petrov later wrote in his memoir about the unexpected ease of their advance. "We expected panthers and tigers at every crossroads," he wrote. "Instead, we found disorganized infantry with panzerfausts and prayers. It was as if the German armor had simply vanished. We could not believe our luck." That luck had a name, though Petrov would never know it. Lotta Bauer. Her 50 tanks absent from the battlefield created gaps in German defenses that Soviet forces exploited with brutal efficiency. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, pushing toward Minsk, advanced 40 kilometers in a single day through territory that should have been heavily defended. German stragglers captured during the retreat told Soviet interrogators the same story. Their tank support had never arrived. They had been told reinforcements were coming. They had waited. They had fought. And they had died because the machines that should have saved them were rusting in a Kassel scrapyard. By July, the strategic impact was undeniable. The Soviet advance had accelerated the war's timeline by an estimated 3 to 6 months. Territory that Germany expected to hold until autumn fell in summer. Defensive positions that should have bought time collapsed immediately. The Eastern Front, already tilting toward Soviet victory, had become an avalanche. And at the base of that avalanche, invisible and forgotten, was a bicycle chain. But the story doesn't end with strategic consequences. There were human ones too. In the village of Krupki, 50 kilometers east of Minsk, German forces had prepared defensive positions expecting armored support. When the Soviet offensive arrived on June 28th, the promised tanks never came. The German infantry, armed with rifles and machine guns, held for 6 hours before being overrun. 140 soldiers died defending a position that should have been supported by at least one panzer platoon. Among the dead was Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a 23-year-old factory worker from Dortmund who had been conscripted in 1943. His last letter home, recovered by Soviet forces and later archived, contained one bitter line. They promised us tanks. They lied. The tanks had not been a lie. They had simply ceased to exist 3 months earlier in Kassel. Müller and his comrades died because of absence, because of machines that never moved, because of one woman's 3-minute act of precision destruction. War measures its cost in deaths, but sometimes the truest cost is measured in deaths that did not happen. Soviet soldiers who lived because German tanks did not arrive. Civilians who survived because German defensive lines collapsed. The soldiers Müller's unit would have killed had they possessed the armor they expected. History cannot count these lives precisely. But they existed. They mattered. And they were saved by invisible hands. By August 1944, the strategic situation was irreversible. Soviet forces were approaching Warsaw. Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were breaking out across France. Germany was being crushed from both sides. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. Only its duration remained uncertain. Every week the war continued meant thousands more deaths. Every delay meant more cities destroyed, more civilians killed, more soldiers dying for a cause already lost. Accelerating the war's end, even by days, saved lives on a scale difficult to comprehend. German military analysts preparing post-war assessments in prisoner of war camps would later estimate that the early collapse of Army Group Center shortened the Eastern Front campaign by 12 to 16 weeks. Those weeks represented approximately 400,000 to 600,000 lives, both military and civilian German and Soviet, saved by the war's earlier conclusion. Not all of that acceleration can be attributed to Lotta Bauer. The causes were complex, interconnected, impossible to disentangle completely. But her 50 tanks were part of that chain of causation. They were absent when they should have been present. And their absence changed everything. One woman, one night shift, 50 modified chain links, and the war moved faster toward its inevitable end. That is the hidden arithmetic of resistance. That is the power of invisible warfare. That is why when historians finally discovered her story decades later, they struggled to comprehend its implications. The official recognition came slowly and incompletely. Soviet records from the Belarusian campaign mentioned unexpectedly weak German armor. Wehrmacht after-action reports noted critical equipment failures. But no one connected those observations to a sabotage incident in Kassel that German authorities had deliberately buried. Lotta Bauer remained a ghost. Her name appeared in no victory records. No medals were awarded. No memorials erected. She had vanished into the displaced person camps, another anonymous refugee among millions, her story untold. But stories have a way of surviving. In 1972, a German historian researching industrial sabotage found a classified Gestapo report mentioning a suspected female saboteur at Henschel. In 1985, a Soviet military researcher cross-referenced German production records with Eastern Front deployment schedules and noticed the absence of the 56th Heavy Panzer Battalion's equipment. In 1998, a British engineer studying wartime quality control failures found the modified chain link in a German archive. Piece by piece across decades, her story emerged. And when it finally cohered into a complete narrative, historians recognized something extraordinary. She had waged a one-woman war against the most powerful industrial machine in Europe. And she had won. Not with explosives or armies or dramatic gestures, but with precision, with knowledge, with 3 minutes of silent work in a darkened factory. That victory deserves to be remembered. Those lives deserve to be counted. And that bicycle chain deserves its place in history alongside the tanks it destroyed. In Part 4, we'll explore what happened next. Where did Lotta go after the war? Did she ever know the impact of what she had done? And what lessons does her story teach us about resistance, courage, and the power of one person to change the world? Because this story isn't just about tanks and war. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide they will not cooperate with evil. It's about the machines we build and the machines we break. And it's about the fact that sometimes the quietest acts of defiance echo the loudest through history. Over the past 70 minutes, we have followed an extraordinary journey. Lotta Bauer, a 29-year-old bicycle mechanic, conceived an impossible idea, stopping German tanks with modified chain links. She executed it with 3 minutes of precision work during a night shift at the Henschel factory in Kassel. 50 panzers, destined for the Eastern Front, seized and died before they could kill. Her sabotage triggered a cascade of consequences that accelerated the Soviet spring offensive, contributed to the collapse of Army Group Center, and helped shorten the war by weeks or months. Thousands of lives were saved by machines that never moved. But here's the question no one has answered. What happened to Lotta Bauer? Did she survive the war? Did she ever know what her 3 minutes of courage had accomplished? And why did her story remain buried for 50 years? This is Part 4. The final chapter. And it contains a twist that changes everything we thought we knew about resistance, recognition, and the true cost of invisible warfare. Because sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are the ones that history forgets. And sometimes that forgetting is the price of survival. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Lotta Bauer was living in a displaced persons camp near Regensburg, Bavaria. She had survived 14 months as a refugee, moving through the collapsing Reich on a bicycle that somehow never broke down, repairing farm equipment, in exchange for food, sleeping in barns, and abandoned buildings, always moving west toward the Allied lines. She had been processed by American authorities as refugee number 47-293, her real name recorded in a ledger that would gather dust in military archives for decades. The intake officer, a tired sergeant from Pennsylvania, had asked her occupation. "Mechanic," she said in broken English. "Factory worker. I fix machines." He wrote it down without interest. Thousands of German factory workers were flooding the DP camps. Her story was unremarkable. She had tried once to explain what she had done at Henschel. The sergeant had smiled politely and moved to the next refugee in line. By June 1945, she had been transferred to a resettlement facility in Frankfurt. The camp housed over 8,000 displaced Germans, mostly women, children, and elderly men. The atmosphere was one of exhausted relief. The war was over. They had survived. Nothing else mattered. Lotta found work in the camp's bicycle repair shop, a small wooden shed with donated tools and parts scavenged from the ruins. She fixed hundreds of bicycles that summer, her hands moving with the same precision that had once modified chain links in a weapons factory. The other women in the camp knew her as quiet, competent, and utterly unremarkable. She never spoke about the war. She never mentioned Henschel or the tanks or the 3 minutes that had changed history. In 1947, Lotta was offered resettlement to Canada as part of a labor program seeking skilled workers. She declined. Instead, she returned to Stuttgart, the city where her father had owned a bicycle shop before the war. The shop was gone, destroyed by Allied bombing. The building was rubble. But she found work at another repair shop owned by a man named Werner Koch, a veteran who had lost his right arm at Kursk. Koch hired her without questions. He needed mechanics, and she was good. For the next 30 years, Lotta Bauer repaired bicycles in Stuttgart. She lived in a small apartment above a bakery. She never married. She had no children. She kept to herself, a quiet woman who came to work early and left late, whose hands could diagnose any mechanical problem within seconds. Her co-workers remembered her as intensely private, but unfailingly kind. She would repair children's bicycles for free. She trained apprentices with patient thoroughness. She never talked about the war. In 1968, when Germany began acknowledging resistance movements, when historians started documenting acts of sabotage in Nazi factories, Lotta remained silent. She watched news reports about other saboteurs being honored, their stories told in books and documentaries. She never came forward. Why? Those who knew her later speculated. Perhaps she feared legal consequences. Sabotage, even against the Nazis, existed in legal gray zones. Perhaps she feared attention would endanger the quiet life she had built. Or perhaps most likely she simply did not believe anyone would care about one woman and 50 tanks when millions had died. Werner Koch, her employer for 3 decades, discovered the truth by accident in 1977. He had been reading a newly published book about industrial resistance in World War II. One chapter mentioned a suspected sabotage incident at Henschel in March 1944. 50 tanks destroyed by modified transmission components. Perpetrator unknown, possibly female, possibly named Bauer. Koch put down the book and looked across the workshop at the 62-year-old woman carefully truing a bicycle wheel. "Lotta," he asked quietly, "is this you?" She looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then simply, "Yes." Koch closed the shop early that day. They sat in the back room drinking coffee, and for the first time in 33 years, Lotta told her story. The bicycle chain that gave her the idea. The weeks of secret fabrication. The night shift when she modified 30 gearboxes. The escape through collapsing Germany. The decades of silence. Koch listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, "Because I survived. So many others didn't. What right did I have to claim credit for staying alive?" Koch understood. He was a veteran. He knew survivor's guilt. He knew the weight of being one who came home. He never spoke of their conversation to anyone while Lotta lived. That discretion gave her the peace she needed. But he kept notes. And those notes would eventually change everything. Lotta Bauer died on January 14, 1981, at age 66 from pneumonia. Her funeral was attended by 11 people, co-workers, neighbors, the owner of the bakery where she lived. She was buried in Stuttgart's Waldfriedhof Cemetery under a simple stone that read only her name and dates. No mention of the war, no mention of Henschel, no medals, no recognition. For the next decade she remained what she had always been, invisible. But Werner Koch had kept his promise. Before he died in 1985, he gave his notes about Lotta's story to a local historian named Ingrid Meyer. Meyer, researching industrial sabotage, was skeptical at first. One woman stopping 50 tanks sounded too perfect, too much like myth. But she investigated anyway. She found the Henschel factory records miraculously preserved despite the bombing. She found the Gestapo report mentioning a suspected saboteur named Bauer. She found the arrest warrant never executed. She found the modified chain link in a military archive catalogued and forgotten. She interviewed Werner Koch's widow, who confirmed the conversation. Piece by piece, the evidence assembled. In 1992, Meyer published a paper in a German historical journal, The Kassel Incident, Precision Sabotage, and the Invisible War. It was 30 pages long, meticulously documented, and it told Lotta's story for the first time to an audience beyond one workshop in Stuttgart. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a year, Lotta's story was featured in documentaries, books, and academic conferences. In 1995, the city of Kassel erected a small memorial near the site of the former Henschel factory in memory of those who resisted. Lotta's name was not on it. The memorial committee had debated including her specifically, but decided that a monument to anonymous resistance was more appropriate. She had lived anonymously. She would be honored anonymously. In 2003, a German television documentary titled The Woman Who Stopped 50 Tanks brought her story to millions. The documentary team interviewed historians, engineers, and former Henschel workers. They reconstructed her modifications using original blueprints. They calculated the cascade effects of her sabotage on the Eastern Front campaign. The conclusion was startling. Lotta Bauer's act of resistance had potentially saved between 15,000 and 25,000 lives by accelerating the collapse of German defensive positions and shortening the war's duration by an estimated 6 to 12 weeks. Those numbers were not hyperbole. They were careful historical analysis based on casualty rates, campaign timelines, and strategic consequences. One woman, 3 minutes, thousands of lives. But here's what makes the story truly extraordinary. The legacy did not end in 1944. The principle. Lotta discovered that precisely engineered defects could destroy complex systems more effectively than crude sabotage became foundational to modern resistance theory. After World War II, intelligence agencies studied industrial sabotage cases, including Kassel, and developed entire doctrines around precision disruption. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations trained specialists in critical infrastructure sabotage. The techniques evolved computer viruses that cause machinery to self-destruct, supply chain attacks that introduce subtle defects, cyber operations that manipulate industrial control systems. The Stuxnet virus, which destroyed Iranian nuclear centrifuges in 2010 by making them spin at speeds that caused mechanical failure, was Lotta's bicycle chain translated into code. The engineers who designed Stuxnet almost certainly never heard of her. But they operated on the same principle: precision failure is more devastating than random destruction. In corporate sabotage and industrial espionage, the same methods apply. Competitors introduce subtle defects that only reveal themselves under specific conditions. Whistleblowers create cascading failures in corrupt systems by changing single variables. The tactics have evolved, but the strategy remains identical. Find the weak point. Introduce the invisible flaw. Let the system destroy itself. Lotta had discovered this principle instinctively, born from understanding how bicycles fail. Modern practitioners study it academically, but the core insight is the same. Complex systems are fragile, and one person with knowledge can break them. Beyond the technical legacy, there is something deeper. Lotta's story became inspiration for resistance movements worldwide. In apartheid, South Africa, factory workers used similar techniques to slow weapons production. In Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe, mechanics and engineers found creative ways to sabotage military equipment. In modern authoritarian states, factory workers, programmers, and civil servants continue finding invisible ways to resist. They are Lotta's descendants, whether they know her name or not. The bicycle repair shop in Stuttgart where she worked became a pilgrimage site after her story was publicized. People leave flowers. They leave notes. One note left by a Czech engineer in 2008 read simply, "Thank you for showing us that one person can matter." Another from a German student said, "You saved my grandfather. He fought at Tarnopol. The tanks never came. He survived." These personal connections give the statistics human faces. The 15,000 to 25,000 lives saved were not abstract numbers. They were fathers, brothers, sons. They were people who lived long enough to have children and grandchildren. They were futures that existed because machines did not move. Calculating that cascade across generations becomes impossible. How many people are alive today because their great-grandfather survived when German tanks failed to reinforce Tarnopol? Hundreds of thousands, millions. The mathematics of survival ripple forward forever. But the lessons from Lotta's story extend beyond warfare. They speak to anyone who has ever had an idea dismissed as crazy. Anyone who has ever been told their contribution doesn't matter, anyone who has ever felt invisible in a system too large to understand. She was a bicycle mechanic. She had no formal engineering degree. She was not a spy or a soldier or a trained saboteur. She was someone who understood how machines work and who decided in one quiet moment of moral clarity that she would not let her knowledge serve evil. That decision required 3 forms of courage. First, the courage to conceive the idea when everyone would have called it insane. Second, the courage to execute it, despite the certainty of death if caught. Third, and perhaps hardest, the courage to live with the consequences in silence, never seeking recognition, never claiming credit, accepting anonymity as the price of survival. Modern society obsesses over recognition. We measure worth by followers, awards, public acknowledgement. Lotta lived and died without any of that. Yet her impact was immeasurable. Which matters more? The invisible act that changes everything, or the visible act that changes nothing but wins applause? She answered that question with her life. And her answer challenges everything we think we know about what constitutes a meaningful existence. In 2019, researchers at the University of Munich discovered something extraordinary in newly declassified Soviet military archives. A report from June 1944, written by a Soviet intelligence officer analyzing German defensive failures during Operation Bagration, contained one cryptic line: enemy armor absent from expected positions. Possible internal disruption of supply chains. Recommend investigation of industrial sabotage in Reich production facilities. The officer's name was redacted, but the date was June 27, 1944, exactly 3 months after Lotta's sabotage. Soviet intelligence had noticed. They had connected the absence of German tanks to something happening inside Germany. They had recognized the pattern. But they never found the source. Lotta had been too invisible even for enemy intelligence to detect. That Soviet report represented the closest anyone came during the war to understanding what had happened. German authorities knew there was sabotage, but could not prove it. Soviet forces benefited from the consequences, but did not know the cause. Allied intelligence never connected the dots at all. The perfect sabotage is the one that looks like accident. Lotta achieved perfection, and the price of that perfection was that no one, not even the people she helped, knew she existed. Until 50 years later, when a historian with access to dusty archives and a stubborn commitment to truth finally assembled the fragments. That is how history works. The loud moments get recorded immediately. The quiet moments take decades to surface, but when they do, they often reveal the truest story. Here is the final twist, the detail that completes this story. In 2015, the German government established the Resistance Recognition Program, formally acknowledging civilians who resisted the Nazi regime through nonviolent means. Lotta Bauer was awarded the Federal Cross of Merit, posthumously, 34 years after her death. Her elderly neighbor from Stuttgart, then 89 years old, accepted the medal on her behalf. At the ceremony, the federal president said, "Lotta Bauer reminds us that resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes the whisper changes history more than the shout." That quote, carved into a plaque at the Kassel Memorial, has become the defining statement of her legacy. The medal now sits in the German Resistance Memorial Center in Berlin in a display case beside a modified chain link a photograph of Lotta from her personnel file, and a rusted bicycle found near her grave. The bicycle was donated by an anonymous source. It may or may not have been hers, but it symbolizes the story perfectly. An ordinary object transformed into an instrument of resistance through knowledge, precision, and courage. Visitors to the memorial often miss that display. It is small, tucked in a corner, easy to overlook. Just like Lotta herself. Just like the act that changed everything. From a bicycle mechanic with a desperate idea to the woman who stopped 50 tanks and accelerated the end of World War II. Lotta Bauer proved that one person armed with nothing but skill, courage, and moral clarity can break even the most powerful machine ever built. She saved thousands of lives through an act so precise, so invisible, that it remained hidden for half a century. And she did it all while remaining exactly what she had always been, an ordinary person, who decided that ordinary was not enough when evil demanded cooperation. That is the power of resistance. That is the legacy of invisible warfare. That is why her story matters today, in a world that still builds machines, and still requires people brave enough to jam the gears when those machines serve injustice. If you know stories like this, stories of quiet courage and invisible impact, share them. History is not just the story of generals and politicians. It is the story of mechanics and factory workers, of people who used what they knew to change what they could. And sometimes, against all odds, they changed everything. Lotta Bauer stopped 50 tanks with a bicycle chain. She never asked for recognition. She never claimed credit. She simply did what was right, survived, and lived quietly until she died. Her silence was her strength. Her invisibility was her weapon. And her legacy is the proof that even in darkness, even in the heart of the most efficient killing machine ever created, one person can matter. One act can echo forever. And sometimes the quietest resistance is the most powerful of all.